The 2025 International Colloquium Series Europe is sponsored by Union Theological Seminary in the City of New York, the Episcopal Diocese of California, King's College London, Regent's Park College, University of Oxford, the Center for Black Theology at Regent's Park College, Oxford, the Protestant Theological Institute of Paris, and in partnership with the Cathedral Church of the Holy Trinity, the American Cathedral in Paris.
The Northern California Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Community Foundation is dedicated to promoting justice, health, education, and service. Please consider making a donation at NorcalMLKFoundation.org. Every donation makes a difference.
Welcome both Dwights. The one I'm going to introduce is Professor Dwight Hopkins, who I did introduce this morning, but it's great to now be able to introduce in person rather than in absence. Dwight is the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Professor at the University of Chicago. His academic courses combine the humanities with the study of wealth ownership, especially opening up possibilities for newer economic classes in society to realise their dreams of a better life. His research topics include historic and contemporary black ownership of wealth with a theological consideration, black theologies of liberation, social entrepreneurship for all, and contemporary models of theology. It's a pleasure to welcome you back to King's, and we look forward very much to hearing from you this afternoon. Thank you. And thank you for coming straight from the airport after your flight was cancelled.
No worries. Good morning, good afternoon. We had an arduous task, but both Dwights are here. That's Dwight the second, so that makes me Dwight the first. Thank you so much for Susannah and Ellen, King's College, behind the scenes staff, I'm sure, that participated. It's good to see old friends and new ones I'm going to make. So this paper is concerned about the following question. How is it possible for poor and working class people of the United States of America to live a life of freedom? To live a life of freedom. Here, freedom means not owing anything or anyone anything, so one can freely practice daily his or her purpose on earth. I argue that faith plus wealth equals freedom answers this question. Faith plus wealth equals freedom answers the question, how is it possible for poor and working class people of the United States of America to live a life of freedom? For me, freedom means not owing anything or anyone anything, as we mentioned. And wealth denotes earth, air, and water on the material level, and then perfect balance of the life energy inside of our bodies on the spiritual level. And faith, for Christians, embodies the Jesus stories, and perhaps for others, an ultimate concern beyond the individual self. The paper will touch on 5 theses to substantiate this claim that faith plus wealth equals freedom. And these themes draw from various sources: the Bible, my personal family history, Black American experiences, and business theory. By way of introduction, 2 things impact my research question and my combined theology and business response. First is my definition of Black liberation theology. Black liberation theology means starting with the liberation message of Jesus and discerning how that liberation is revealed in theology and in Black American experiences. In the phrase Black liberation theology, the leading factor, the word that defines the rest of the phrase, the word that adjudicates the other two, and the word that asks, have we been faithful to our calling? That main word is the Jesus story of liberation. And so my Black liberation theology begins with the Jesus parables about liberation that anchor my research and way of living. Without me first clarifying the Jesus stories, my understanding of the word Black and the word theology in Black liberation theology, my understanding is stunted. Several Jesus stories give substance to Jesus' sense of his own vocation and how he defined the vocation for all of humankind. First, we look at Luke chapter 4, verses 16 through 21. And here one could argue that this is the only place where Jesus offers us his self-understanding of why he is on earth. In a sense, it is the inaugural state of the cosmos speech. And what is this first annunciation to the world explaining why Jesus came to earth? It says, quote, he went to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, quote, the Spirit of the Lord is on me, because it has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. It has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And then Jesus rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. Close quote. We must remember that the year of the Lord's favor refers to the book of Leviticus chapter 25, a period of God's favor and blessing of the poor and the oppressed. Furthermore, the phrase is associated with the year of Jubilee, denoting a period of debt forgiveness, land restitution, and freedom from physical slavery. The thread here is liberation of working people, the poor, and those oppressed. And the remedy is freedom from debt, the end of physical slavery, and the return of land to people. Land restitution brings access to air and ideally water. Land, air, and water constitute wealth. Moreover, the Jesus story of granting gold to different servants as an investment opportunity to multiply wealth exhibits and thereby broadens our understanding of the human vocation. We find this in Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 21. The point of this story is to answer what would Jesus have his followers do with abundant resources right in front of them. What attitude should they take toward capital and return on investments in a Christian framing of accumulation and allocation of capital? In brief, what is the fundamental relationship between Jesus' proclamation of spiritual and material freedom on the one hand, and Jesus' imperative to realize outside returns on initial investments on the other? Matthew 25 reads as follows, quote, again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. He says, Master, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. Close quote. So as we keep in mind Luke chapter 4 and this Matthew 25 Jesus story, they suggest the importance of learning from business schools, Wall Street, and Silicon Valley. Specifically, we pinpoint the necessity or vocational call for working class and poor people to intentionally make wealth work for them. For instance, this Matthew 25 passage offers the following lessons. Don't hoard wealth, rather use it to multiply wealth. Financial literacy for poor and working people. One needs to learn business management. How does one organize the intricacies of enterprise? What role does marketing play? The dynamics of money flow hinge to a large degree on how wide one's relationships are to an ever-growing web of people relationships. Complementing this Matthew 25 story is another one of Jesus' instructions where he teaches the following. From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded, and from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. In Luke chapter 4, verse 48. Finally, and very importantly, wealth requires a deep grasp and nuanced practice of business ethics. Indeed, the best business ethics statement in the world is the Mensarius Oath of Ethical Investing. In addition to my understanding of the Jesus stories, the second factor impacting my research, question, and my combined theology and business response is my personal journey, which, like the Jesus stories, connects faith and wealth as a condition for practicing freedom. My family genealogy goes back 5 generations in the state of Virginia in the United States of America and interweaves church participation and belief in the Jesus stories with business ownership. I am the 6th generation with 3 additional generations since my birth. Dwight II is the 7th generation, and then my great-nieces and great-great-nieces are the 8th and 9th generation of Hopkins in the United States. Though the dominant Hopkins Christian institution was Baptist, the Episcopal church culture molded worship and belief due to the ever-present Episcopalian or Anglican heritage handed down since the founding of Virginia College in 1607. So these 2 preconditioned factors, the Jesus parables and my personal story. Now, even though we have analyzed Bible interpretations in my personal story, we still can question the foundation of this very paper. Is the argument of faith plus wealth equals freedom really clear, cogent, and compelling? To engage in such a conversation requires at least the exploration of 5 theses that deny my argument. To recap, my research project focuses on faith plus wealth equals freedom and draws on academic sources from the Black religious tradition and business theory. My argument, as I mentioned, is the following. To achieve freedom for African American citizens locked out of opportunities, we need to broaden ownership of the wealth in the U.S. while believing in a power greater than an individual. This applies again specifically to working class and poor Black Americans. So the 5 theses that deny my own claim. First is a religious counterclaim thesis. It asserts that the history of the Black American religious tradition has created a narrative positioning the first Africans brought to the 13 colonies as victims of a 1619 Jamestown, Virginia settler Christian colony. As the argument goes, such a colonial Christianity, the thesis advances, the counter thesis, was capitalist or moving across the threshold from semi-feudal land ownership to capitalism. Thus, since capitalist Christianity of the slave master set the conditions for the birth of Black religion as its own Black religion has to draw on its own sources to forge a constructive Black religion. One of those sources cannot be a private ownership of wealth Christianity. Black religion itself cannot utilize the negative system that partially provided the motivation for its creation, as the counter thesis goes. Consequently, the religious counterclaim posits that Black religion at its core is anti-private ownership of wealth. To be its own originality, Black religion dispenses with capitalist accumulation of wealth or any dimensions of the capitalist religion that exploited it. And by this logical definition, Black religion is incompatible with the notion of faith plus wealth equals freedom, religious counterclaim. The second is a Christian biblical counterclaim. Those who argue this stance paraphrase passages from the Bible where they discover the following injunction from Paul. Quote, money is the root of all evil, which is an interpretation of 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10. Therefore, if the sacred text of the Christian tradition clearly defines money as the foundation of evil, then theologically and faith-wise, one cannot put together faith plus wealth to equal freedom for Christians. On the contrary, private ownership of wealth is to engage in evil, not freedom. Thus, if the Bible so clearly warns an avoidance of the danger of money, Christians of any persuasion must tear asunder any faith-wealth interaction. Not freedom, but sin can result from such a lack of distinction. The third is a business theory counterclaim. Writing in 1970 in the New York Times article, Milton Friedman, who was a famous University of Chicago economist, basically said that when you invest in businesses, the main goal is return on capital for the ownership of wealth. You cannot involve in doing good or faith or religion. So for the business theory side, they attack the joining of faith plus wealth equals freedom. The fourth is an economic theory counterclaim. Karl Marx stated that capitalism was inherently exploitative of the working class and other sectors of society who were the most distant from private ownership of wealth or capital. So too, he stated that religion or faith is the opiate of the people, especially the working class and poor in all societies. If capitalism is exploitation and religion is a debilitating drug, then we cannot have faith plus wealth equals freedom, because it contradicts the research and conceptual framework of Karl Marx. And the fifth is a worldview outlook counterclaim. It sees a world where all Black American citizens are victims of an oppressive system. Because of this origin myth, Blacks appear hermetically sealed within, quote, white supremacy capitalism. Consequently, one cannot think about freedom because the underlying presupposition of this origin myth is perpetually reacting and fighting against an ever-present white normativity. To talk about Black people in North America is to begin always with how white racism has permanently always ensnared this total Black population in an intersectional, never-ending state of reactivity and victimology. When we look at Black Americans, we see victims. If one begins with victimhood and lacking agency, then one cannot realize faith plus wealth equals freedom, which requires agency. So 5 counter-theses denying my own argument. My faith plus wealth equals freedom argument refutes these counterclaims by offering a positive view of Africans and Blacks in the 13 colonies in the United States and subsequently the US nation itself. And I document conceptually and practically how private ownership of wealth, religion, and doing good all go together. First, from the arrival of the first group of enslaved Africans through the creation of Black Americans today, the Black religious tradition has always provided examples of how Black private ownership of wealth was compatible with Christianity. We have lots of examples of people who were enslaved who were millionaires, and I could talk about the question and answer, but just to give you the documentation, and maybe the period that you're most familiar with, where faith plus wealth equals freedom, was the 1950s and 1960s civil rights movement in the United States. We know the amazing leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., of the preachers and the women who were involved in that, Fannie Lou Hamer, et cetera. But what's often underestimated is the role of Black ownership of wealth that was the foundation for the success of the movement. For example, these Black businessmen and women provided the hotels that Black people stayed in, the restaurants they ate in, the church buildings that they owned, the Black-owned taxis that they sustained during the movement. Likewise, Dr. King, in all of his oratory and theoretical and philosophical sophistication and biblical hermeneutics, was not unaware of the importance of economy, Black religion, and freedom. For example, in the last speech he gave the evening of April 3rd, 1968, Dr. King said this. So this is his last will and testament. He says, quote, and that's all this whole thing is about. We aren't engaged in any negative protests and any negative arguments with anybody. We're saying that we are determined to be men. We're determined to be people. We're saying that we are God's children, that we're God's children. We don't have to live like we're forced to live. We don't have to argue with anybody. We don't have to curse and go around acting with our words. We don't need any bricks or bottles. But deposit your money in the Black-owned bank. Go by the Black-owned Savings and Loan Association. This is his last speech before he's assassinated. Put your money there. You have 6 or 7 black insurance companies here in the city of Memphis. Now we begin the process of building an economic base. So, King is clearly an example of yoking together, to my perspective, faith plus wealth equals freedom. The second, in addition to the legacy, a history of combining wealth with black religion, as we indicated, there is a long history of black Americans having agency and a proactive posture resulting from employing private ownership of capital to move their families and communities in freedom. So there's a long tradition of individuals in community, from Magdalena Walker, who was from Richmond, Virginia, my town. She was the first woman in the United States to actually create a bank. We didn't know that she had to be a black woman. To David Stewart, who's a multi-billionaire in the United States, who has done a lot for churches, done a lot for historic black universities and colleges. To Robert F. Smith, who pays off the debt for Morehouse graduates, which is huge. If you ever had student loans, maybe in the US context, I'd get an amen right now, but this is England. Third, my argument is faith derives from the biblical stories. So if we read 1 Timothy closely, what it actually says is that it doesn't say that money is the root of all evil. It says the love or coveting of money is the root of all evil. Fourth, scores of capitalist businesses are proving the viability of maximizing profits while carrying out social impact goals. We hear such phrases as purpose and profit, cause and capital, mission and margin, and these new movement is often designated as social entrepreneurship. Oftentimes, women and women of color are right in the thick of that. There are various theories. I was going to unravel, explain 5 of them, but there's lots of business theories around it. We can go into Q&A on what are the 5 business theories, if you will. And fifth, the neo-racism theory of black American citizens hermetically sealed within victimization has to account for a major development in the United States. Today, the urban areas where let me just think, in Chicago, where blacks are concentrated in Southside Chicago, they're not run by whites, but by black people who are in the leadership at the legislative level, attorney general level, head of the school board, head of the police chief, chief executives, the mayor, chief judges, head of all the nonprofit. They are black, and there aren't any white people there. So the city of Chicago exemplifies this idea that black power now governs the ghetto. Consequently, the blacks are victims worldview has to account for black people now ruling over many American areas where most people live. To sum up my remarks, faith plus wealth equals freedom is my argument. Again, wealth is defined as ownership of wealth, of earth, air, and water. And also, as I said, wealth is also defined by the harmony and balance of the energy within us. For Christians, we call it the presence of the Holy Spirit. Taoists call it Qi. Faith, as I mentioned, remains in my research as a life-giving belief in a power greater than one individual. And such a broad designation covers a variety of peoples. Again, for Christians, it means the historical Jesus who walked this earth. Throughout his ministry, he promised deliverance for the imprisoned, the thirsty, the homeless, the hungry, and the oppressed, and to bring material and spiritual freedom. And in fact, freedom for me denotes an ongoing process where a person does not owe anyone or anything, so that person is free to fulfill his or her calling, ever from the moment they wake up to the moment they sleep, and even in their dreaming. That is ultimate freedom, not to be burdened by ownership to anyone or anything. And so we've tried to give both some biblical references, personal story in terms of Hopkins' generations, 9 generations in Virginia. We looked at some of the historical black religious history, black secular history we mentioned, and some business theory, at least the 5 theories we can go into later, to really try to provoke us to think about, can we connect both the divinity school and the business school on behalf of poor and working class people? Thank you.
really grateful for the opportunity to respond to Dr. Hopkins' paper. I found it both profound and very challenging, and I want to start my response with a double confession. First, I don't think I've ever uttered a sentence that includes capitalism and good in it, other than disjunctive. And this is most recently as a result of having learned from the diagnosis and critique of racial capitalism that has developed within the black Marxist tradition and has been taken forward by theologians such as Kerry Day and Jonathan Tran. Thus, Dr. Hopkins' advocacy of a certain embrace of capitalism in the context of the argument that freedom for black Americans entails faith plus wealth is a distinct challenge to my deepest intellectual sensibilities. Second, however, the second aspect of my confession. I was ashamed to find myself well described by an article in the magazine The Week, a weekly news digest, which wryly commented on the ease with which left-leaning academics go around critiquing capitalism and other modern ills, while continuing to benefit from them. Here I am, having been helped onto the housing ladder by my parents, and hoping to do the same for my children, denouncing that very system that underpins this form of intergenerational security. Thus, I'm doubly challenged by Dr. Hopkins' argument. It is, at least on the surface, and I will come back to this later, against what I theoretically stand for, and yet I'm caught red-handed by it. This leaves me in a quandary. I'm going to switch to first names now, if you don't mind. It's a little easier on the tongue. So while puzzling over this quandary, I've also been reading Raymond Carr's fantastic, hot-off-the-press trilogy, Theology in the Mode of the Monk. Here we have it here, for those of you who weren't here this morning. And this has led me to a rereading of Dwight's paper, just below the surface, or between the cracks, as Raymond might say, which has opened up new possibilities, both in terms of the significance of what Dwight is doing, and in respect of my own predicament. In short, and with gratitude to Raymond, I ask whether one can read Dwight as signifying on capitalism. Let me explain. Signifying on, as Raymond tells us, is a trope or hermeneutical strategy that emerges out of black folk tradition, often involving indirection or even sleight of hand, in which the tools to hand, aspects of one's own tradition or another's tradition, are creatively taken up, reinterpreted, perhaps redeployed, in more or less subversive ways, and I think more or less is to be taken seriously there, and perhaps in more or less concealed ways. Raymond reads Coe as signifying on Bart in just this way. It's a strategy that particularly lends itself to situations in which straightforward access to agency and power is lacking, in which one must, quote, make a way out of nowhere. Black slaves did this in relation to the Christian gospel of their white slave masters, and downstream from those creatively subversive beginnings, the need for such signifying on remains in different ways. Can Dwight's paper be read through this lens? That's my question. I'm really not sure of the answer, so I'm very interested to hear what you have to say here. Let me test out doing so in relation to three related aspects of his paper: wealth, growth, and ownership, in the course of which a potential critique of capitalism will also come through, although I won't dwell on this for long because it's well known, and indeed it's very well summarised by Dwight himself in his paper. First, and centrally, Dwight links freedom with wealth, defining wealth in terms of, quote, ownership of earth, air, and water, and all things derived from them. Bracketing for now the question of ownership, and I'll return to this later, let me focus on the move from the basic elements of life, air, earth, and water, to all things derived from them, which in a capitalist system includes money in the form of financial profit. Furthermore, core to our finance-dominated capitalism is the principle that money begets money, and this principle is something that Dwight seems to affirm in his reading of the parable of the talents in Matthew 25. At first blush, this seems to me to be an insidious move from those elements fundamental to the sustenance of life, which are in important ways inalienably shared goods. Sorry, another mouthful. We breathe the same air, we live together in the land, we are supported by the same waters. So a move from those shared elements by which we are constituted to something that floats free of their earthiness and circulates divisively and competitively, in other words, money. Moreover, if the earthy elements are themselves caught up within the logic of the financial market, they themselves become subject to division and competition. But, and here's my alternative reading, what if we take Dwight as going in the other direction? What if he is implicitly rooting a market gone wild back in the tangible goods of life, making the market both answerable to them and in service of them. This possibility is enhanced if we focus on another aspect of his definition of wealth, which continues from wealth as ownership of earth, etc., and continues as expanding that ownership for people locked out of such ownership. If someone who accumulates wealth but does not unlock wealth for those currently locked out of the system, if such a person does not count as wealthy, then we have a very interesting situation. Wealth has been utterly redefined here. The emphasis has shifted back from the roulette of money begetting money to expanded ownership, the increased sharing of those goods that should not be subject to competition. Wealth is defined, in other words, not purely in financial terms, but in terms of what one does with that money. The wealthy person is the one who uses her gain not just to help others, also that, but to spread the capacity for such wealthiness, now redefined in terms of sharing. This seems to me to be a subversive model indeed. I'd love to know whether I'm reading you at all correctly here. Once we've had our eyes opened to this subversion, much else in Dwight's paper can strike us afresh. Dwight builds on the parable of the talents by directing us to what we might learn from business schools. Among the principles he elaborates is, don't hoard wealth, rather use it to multiply wealth. Financial capitalism again, or should we hear, is this a message question, do we hear here financial capitalism here, or should we hear the expansive sharing I've just talked about? And here is a further principle that he enunciates. The dynamics of money flow hinge to a large degree on how wide one's relationships are to an ever-growing web of people relationships. Global capitalism? Or does this redefine wealth in terms of one's relationships with those who would otherwise be locked out of wealth? So a kind of relationism which goes beyond capitalism as we know it. Dwight cites Luke 12:48, which reads, "From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded, and from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked." Wealth not shared, we might elaborate, redounds negatively on the one who has it. Wealth not shared is not truly wealth, in other words. Positively, we could say, to be wealthy is to share. Adumbrating this reading, Dwight footnotes his first definition of wealth. You won't have seen this, but I did. With reference not just to Luke 4, Jesus' message of liberation, but to Matthew 25, the parable of the Last Judgment, which interestingly comes later in that same chapter that housed the parable of the talents. Hopkins reads this as teaching us the practical vocation of human beings, to liberate the least of these by clothing the naked and visiting those in prison, and so on. To reread capitalism through Matthew 25:31 and following, this is surely to signify on capitalism. Second, tell me if I'm going too long, Dwight talks about growing the wealth pie in the USA, and I think this didn't come in your oral rendition today, but it was there in the longer paper. And this sets alarm bells ringing for those who are concerned about climate change, aware of the finitude of our planet, and the unsustainability of endless growth. And when he continues, so that all stakeholders benefit, especially those who lack wealth, it is hard not to read this in terms of a philanthropy parasitic on a growing wealth divide. Growth policies are de rigueur for economists, as Kate Raworth exposes in her Donut Economics, herself proposing something which counters economist orthodoxy, but which is so far from societal sensibilities, addicted as they are to growth, that it's hard to imagine how it will begin to catch on. Governments who espouse both climate policies and growth policies, many governments, including ours, mire themselves in a seemingly intractable contradiction. But what does Dwight mean exactly by growth? And I think here there's another kind of signifying on to be discovered. What if we take growing the wealth pie to mean not GDP or some other financial measure, but the people pie? If wealth is by definition rooted in ownership and sharing of the sustaining elements of life, then it's fundamentally not a financial measure, but has to do with relations between earth, air, water, and people. Growing the wealth pie would mean expanding the network of life-giving sharing to those who have previously been excluded. Growth, in other words, is the expansion of practices of sharing. In keeping with this, Dwight contrasts USA capitalism, so redefined, perhaps, to monopoly capitalism and crony capitalism to partnership economics. But isn't capitalism inherently monopolistic? Or I would have thought so before reading this paper. And inherently linked to cronyism, insofar as the group of the favoured gets smaller and smaller, disenfranchising more and more parties. If so, then Dwight signals through his apparent embrace of the mechanisms of capitalism its complete subversion. Non-monopolistic capitalism is perhaps no longer capitalism, other than by name. I come then finally to the question of ownership. There is ownership and there is ownership, and I'm intrigued to know what kind of ownership Dwight is after. Willie James Jennings contrasts the settler model of ownership, in which land becomes a blank slate and is carved up in portions to be bought and sold, to indigenous ways of thinking about ownership, in which the land and the people are symbiotically related, such that there can be no transfer of ownership. The land is as much in the people as they are in the land. This kind of wealth is even more earthed than it is in Dwight's definition. Somewhere in between these two, however, is the blueprint of Leviticus 25 with its Jubilee year, which he also alludes to. On the one hand, in Leviticus 25, land can be bought and sold, but on the other hand, at regular intervals and relatively frequently, every 50 years, it reverts to its original owners. Moreover, the 50th year is to be rest for the land, with nothing being sown or reaped. As has been frequently noted, a Jubilee year, however reinterpreted for the present, is a very radical proposition. The people's relationship with their land may not be as close as it is in indigenous imaginations on Jennings's reading, but there is nevertheless in this Jubilee model an inalienability of people from land and vice versa. That has been entirely lost in the proto-capitalist settler model. If liberation is also for and of the land in this way, as Dwight's linking of Luke 4 to Leviticus 25 seems to imply, then what havoc does this wreak with our notions of ownership and wealth? And I want to end by asking, is Dwight quietly wreaking such havoc? Thank you. I'm just thinking about timings. I've posed so many questions to him that it might be nice if we had a quick. Would that be nice?
Sure.
Yes, it would be very nice.
It was just two things. One, so a lot of what I'm talking about is motivated by my own practical experience. So when I was at university, I spent 4 years working with black prisoners in Boston prisons, listening to them. When I was in graduate school, I spent 7 years organizing in Harlem and Bedford-Stuy. And then when I came to Oakland, I worked 6 years in East Oakland, which is now totally gentrified. And then I've been working 18 years in the South Side of Chicago, one community, one black area there. So it's been 35 years of working with people who are raising questions. For me, what happens on cable news, what we talk about, really, in those areas haven't had much impact, right? So just to see, a lot of these questions are motivated from that. It's very important for me, it's motivated from that. And I'm trying to answer those questions. Second thing too, I think we're trying to figure out what's the relationship between the ultimate, that is when Jesus comes again, and full heaven is on earth as it is in heaven, and what it means between now and the penultimate. We're in the penultimate with the ultimate. So that's a larger framework. Those three things, just my own experience. And I can't speak for, there are 41 million people of African descent in the United States. I'm only talking about 35 years of these local communities that I've been involved in. I'm not speaking for, I'm not even speaking for them. I'm really a rapporteur. That's really, so when we talk about those communities, I'm pretty feel confident with their raising. Those local, very micro, not, especially with Southside Chicago. There, what happens in cable news doesn't really impact or reflect what they're doing on both sides. I think that the question of wealth can be distinguished, as you indicated. I think that there's wealth in monopoly capitalism and there's wealth in capitalism. Now, the tricky part is that the models we have are socialism, communism in various countries, and we know what happened in 1991, 1989. That led us to it. And then we have the U.S. as a major superpower, which is a monopoly capitalism. Part of what we're trying to think about is on the local area, what models can we see where capitalism can serve the majority of the people? And those 5 models that I didn't go into, they're business theory, but they're all years of, they deal with data. The business school they don't necessarily deal with rhetoric. They deal with data, communities, all of that. And that struck me a lot because I come out of that. That's my Black liberation theology. I'm concerned about poor and working class Black people. I mean, I'm fine with my perspective is Black 1%, fine. I'm a Black professional, I'm not a 1%, but I'm wealthy in relationships, so I'm fine. But those working class people who don't have a right to speak, who can't travel to Europe, whose parents, they're trying to figure out whether or not they use money to pay for medicine, school, or aftercare. Those are the people on the south side of Chicago I'm referring to. And they are motivated by a need to accumulate capital. They do. I'm sorry. They want to be able to fly to Europe. They want to have a backyard. They want to have a dog and all. They want to go to private school. My son goes to University of Chicago Lab School. It's one of the top bourgeois schools in the country. And kids get together and they're studying cartography and mapping. And this kid said, "Wow, why don't we map the whole school?" They went to the teacher. The teacher says, "Organize yourself. Go map the school." Most people don't have that totally bourgeois privilege, But people on the south side of Chicago, when I worked at AT, they want to come to lab school. So somehow we got to come to terms with the rhetoric that we have on cable news and the theories that we have in relation to local communities. And most organizers that I've known, from Saul Lewinsky to the Black Power movement, they were all local. Stokely Carmichael, who initiated the slogan Black Power, emerged out of Mississippi. And I'll finish with this. The original definition of Black Power before we intellectuals and Africana and Afrocentric Pan-Africanist theoreticians, which I love Africa and all that. The original definition for Stokely and Willie Ricks was, Black Power was defined by two things. One, Black rural working class peasants should own the land and the waters around the land. And the second thing, the original definition was, wherever there are majority population, they should have a majority political position. So I'm coming out of that energy. And there's also a thing on environmental racism. So when the white left starts talking about environmental land, there's a concept called environmental racism, which comes out of the Black church in the 1990s, developed by Benjamin Chavis out of North Carolina. So when we talk about saving Mother Earth, we've got to make some distinctions even within the environmental movement. But check up on the term environmental racism from Ben Chavis out of the Black church.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we'll just take 2 minutes for questions for Dwight at this point, and then we'll bring the full panel back here. I'm going to close with a question. Then we're going to do a tiny bit of group work before we have final reflections from our panel. And so that will give you an opportunity to bring in further questions that we haven't got a chance to ask Dwight and others now. Can you hear me?
Thank you so much for your talk. I have a couple of questions. I want to maybe some more questions of information, but what do you think would be the strategy for helping Black community, for example, the south side of Chicago, which incidentally is the city where I was born, to acquire wealth? And I'm also wondering if the fact that you have so much, zoning in the States, right? You have the Black community in one part of the city, and then you have the wealthy communities, and in a way that you don't have, for example, in London, because you have council housing in every borough of London. That kind of separation of Black and white communities, to what extent, if at all, do you think that contributes to or hinders the accumulation of wealth?
Cool. Very important questions. Good to see another Chicago here. There are some Black churches on the south side of Chicago who are actually providing models for this. There are some churches who are bringing healthy food. There's food deserts on the south side of Chicago where there are no grocery stores. And sometimes you can see mothers going to public school with children who they just stop at the gas station where they get Cheetos and that's their breakfast. So some churches are responding by linking up with Black farmers in the Midwest, and they're bringing food from the Black farmers through the church to the local neighborhood. That's a good example. Some are developing solar panels as much as, this is all very micro. I mean, this is not macro public policy, but it's a mustard seed, right? Because capitalism, even capitalism itself, it has the ferocious part of it, especially when it's not serving the poor. So some churches are doing that in terms of farming, healthy food. Some of them are developing solar panels and providing lunches for folks. Some are doing things in church and in prisons. So this is what they have to do. So, I think, so when you have a federal record, some jobs you can't get, right, once you're, it doesn't, to me, that has nothing to do with me, and I'm a black person. That has nothing to do with me and my lifestyle, okay? And all the black people about. So that's why I'm talking about poor working class people. How do we solve that problem for them, How do we expunge that whole, that's a huge public policy that impacts generations. And some people, there's a 3 strikes, you're out. Thanks to Joe Biden, sorry. I have a friend who was caught up in there, Harvard graduate. He was smoking reefer, and the 3rd time he went to jail because of the Biden law. So, and this is the black men and black family stuff, how our families were treated. So it's those types of things that I think I still have, a lot of us have, we always joke with preaching and critiquing, we don't love that. But there's some black churches that are doing really, really progressive stuff. Another example is all micro mustard seed. Some of the strongest leadership perhaps are the women, black women, especially the mothers. I give an example and I'll show you. So the day Supreme Court ruled against Harvard and affirmed that, they probably don't know this. So Harvard University was using forms of, some of us say pro-affirmation, it could be a negative, but positive affirmation, which is to say that people of color should be, the people of color, their class background should be taken into account to be admitted to Harvard. So positive affirmation. Some not so positive groups challenged that. They went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court overturned affirmative action Harvard. Now, on the day of that, I listened to 2 things. I listened to one of my good friends who is a public African-American commentator on one of the major networks. His response was, and we're friends, we still have one of milk and cookies, sorry. His thing of that same day, that news was, that's white supremacy, that's white men and Chinese Asians fighting back against black. And then when there was a community organization, the black women said, you know what we got to do? We got to teach our children financial literacy from kindergarten, child. You know what I'm talking about, girl? Yeah, we got to do that, honey. 2 different responses. Actually, the answers are in between. But it was just, that's what they have to do. The women are just so creative, right? Men too, but it's amazing. A single mother who has to raise 11 children is like the CEO of Wall Street. She's a CEO. I can't even deal with this little shorty here. How do you do that, right? So to me, the answer is the people themselves. I don't have to come with anything. It's there. It really is there. If we really believe that, if we're even against the working people, the poor people, those oppressed mothers, they have the answer. They don't have the capital to scale up the answers. That's the real issue. So I can deconstruct it theoretically, but the energy is from below, and this is the heart of all liberation theologies. That's why there's no deviation from liberation theology for me. The energy comes from below. If we're with the people, and I didn't live in the south side of Chicago. We live in the suburbs, okay? You can build a swimming pool inside of our backyard. So I have never, if you read how many books I got, you probably never said, I am poor. I maybe some other black person. I have never, as far as all of us, I'm poor. I'm trying to be faithful to what God has called me to do, which is to serve black, poor, and working class in all of the universe of humanity. So the answers to me are there, and if we have to just struggle to listen to them, and and try to figure it out. So that's the key. That's a Chicago question right there.
The International Colloquium series, confronting global issues with moral clarity and intellectual depth.